In the quiet, misty town of Fairview, 12-year-old Leo Carter was known as the boy who had everything. If you walked past the large brick house at the end of the winding street, you would see a perfectly manicured lawn and a shiny black car parked in the driveway. It was the kind of house that people pointed to when they drove by, whispering about how successful the owner must be. To the neighbors, the Carters were the perfect picture of a happy family. Richard Carter, Leo's father, was a tall, handsome man with a warm smile and a firm handshake. He was always seen in a crisp suit, heading to work or attending charity meetings. He was the kind of man who held doors open for ladies and patted dogs on the head. Everyone in town admired him. They said he was a saint for raising his son all alone after his wife had passed away. But if you looked closer at the windows of that big house, you might notice that the curtains were always drawn tight. You might notice that Leo, the boy who supposedly had it all, never played outside with the other kids. He walked to school with his head down, his shoulders hunched forward as if he was carrying a heavy backpack filled with rocks. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it looked forced and shaky, like he was afraid that showing his teeth might get him into trouble. Inside the house, the air always felt heavy. It wasn't just the silence. It was a specific kind of silence that felt like waiting for a storm to break. The house was spotless, cleaner than most museums. There wasn't a toy on the floor or a cup left on the table. Everything had its place, and if something was even an inch out of line, Richard would notice. For Leo, living there was like walking through a field full of hidden traps. One wrong step, one loud noise, or one speck of dust could change the entire mood of the day in a second. Leo's father had two faces. Outside, in front of the neighbors and the cameras, he was a gentle, loving father. He would ruffle Leo's hair in public and speak about him with such pride that it made people tear up. But inside, when the front door clicked shut, the mask slipped off. Richard didn't hit Leo with his hands. He didn't leave bruises that could be seen by a teacher or a doctor. Instead, he used his voice and his eyes to control the boy. He would stare at Leo for hours if he made a mistake, making him stand in the corner of the living room without moving a muscle. He would speak in a low, cold voice that made Leo's stomach churn, telling him that he was useless, that he was lucky to have a roof over his head, and that nobody else in the world would ever love him. The abuse was slow and steady, like water dripping on a stone. Over the years, it wore Leo down until he felt like a shell of a person. He was terrified at the sound of his father's car pulling into the driveway. His heart would hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. He learned to read his father's mood the moment he walked through the door. If Richard's tie was straight, it might be a safe night. If Richard was tapping his fingers on the table, Leo knew to make himself invisible. Life was a series of strict rules. Leo couldn't just be a boy. He had to be a decoration. He had to sit up straight. He had to eat his food slowly and silently, even if he wasn't hungry. He wasn't allowed to have friends over because, as his father said, other people are messy. They don't understand our standard of living. So, Leo spent his afternoons alone in his room, often just staring at the wall, listening to the ticking of the clock. He felt completely alone in the world, cut off from everyone else. He watched the other kids playing soccer in the street from his bedroom window, wishing he could just run out and join them, but he knew the punishment would be severe. The neighbors didn't see the fear. They only saw the expensive clothes Leo wore and the grades he got in school. They thought he was just a quiet, serious boy who was maybe a bit sad about his mother. They had no idea that the sadness was actually terror. They had no idea that the nice man next door had convinced Leo that the police were the enemy, that teachers were spies, and that if he ever told a soul about what happened inside the house, he would be taken away to a place much, much worse than his current hell. The financial situation in the house was another mystery to Leo, but it was clear his father was obsessed with money. Richard was always on the phone, talking loudly about numbers, investments, and the future. He would often bring home briefcases stuffed with papers and lock them in his study immediately. Sometimes late at night, Leo would hear his father shouting on the phone, swearing and arguing about debts and accounts that didn't make sense. But in the morning, Richard would be calm again, acting as if nothing happened. Then came the Tuesday in November that changed everything. It had been a rainy week. the kind of cold, relentless rain that soaks into your bones. Leo had come home from school and was sitting at the kitchen table doing his homework, trying to be as quiet as a mouse. The doorbell rang. It wasn't the friendly ring of the mailman or a neighbor. It was a heavy, urgent pounding. Leo froze. Richard walked past him, checking his watch, looking annoyed rather than scared. He adjusted his suit jacket and put on his public face, that charming smile that Leo hated so much. "God, don't move, Richard," whispered to Leo before opening the heavy oak front door. When the door swung open, the silence of the house was shattered. It wasn't a neighbor standing there. It was the police. 2 officers in rain slickers stood on the porch, along with a man in a trench coat who looked serious. "Richard Carter?" the officer asked loudly. "That's me," Richard said, his voice smooth and confident. "How can I help you officers today?" "You were under arrest," the officer said, stepping forward. "For embezzlement and fraud relating to the Oak Haven Community Fund." Leo watched from the kitchen doorway, his heart stopping. He saw the color drain from his father's face. For the first time, Leo saw his father look truly scared. The mask was gone. Richard wasn't the charming businessman anymore. He looked like a trapped animal. The officers grabbed Richard by the arms and pulled him out of the house. He didn't go quietly. He started shouting about mistakes and lawyers, but they didn't listen. They handcuffed him right there on the porch, full view of the neighbors, who were now peeking through their own curtains. As they led Richard to the police car, he turned his head. He didn't look at the officers. He looked straight at Leo, who was still standing in the shadows of the hallway. His eyes weren't sad or apologetic. They were full of fire and a silent warning. It was a look that said, "Asterisk, don't you dare say a word." Leo felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold rain. He knew that even though his father was being taken away in a police car, the grip Richard had on him wasn't broken yet. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just changing shape. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the wet, rain-soaked pavement of the driveway, casting strange, dancing shadows against the brick walls of the Carter house. It was a scene straight out of a movie, but for Leo, standing frozen in the hallway, it felt terrifyingly real. The sound of the heavy oak front door slamming shut seemed to echo in his ears. Even over the noise of the rain and the distant rumble of the police car driving away, the house was suddenly quiet, emptier, and colder than it had ever been before. For years, Leo had lived in fear of this man, constantly walking on eggshells to avoid making him angry. But now, seeing his father handcuffed and hauled into the back of a cruiser, a strange feeling mixed with his terror. It was relief. But that relief was quickly replaced by a heavy, sinking feeling in his stomach. He knew that just because Richard was gone didn't mean he was powerless. Within hours, the quiet neighborhood wasn't quiet anymore. News traveled fast in a town like Fairview, especially when it involved a prominent citizen like Richard Carter. By the next morning, reporters were camped out on the sidewalk. Their vans blocked the street, and long microphones were being held like weapons toward the front door. Leo peeked through the heavy curtains in the living room, watching them scramble like ants. He saw cameras flashing and people speaking into headsets. They were hungry for a story. They wanted to know how the town's hero could steal millions of dollars from a charity meant to help sick children. The allegations were shocking. The news reports on the TV in the kitchen, which Leo turned on volume so low it was barely a whisper, painted a grim picture. They said Richard had stolen over $3 million. They talked about fake bank accounts, forged signatures, and shell companies. The reporters used words like betrayal and heartless. Leo watched the screen, mesmerized. He saw his father's face plastered everywhere, but not the smiling, friendly face he showed the neighbors. It was a mugshot, looking angry and defiant. The community was in an uproar. People who had waved hello to Richard that same morning were now on the news, calling him a monster and a traitor, while the town outside was angry and loud. Inside the house, Leo was dealing with a different kind of invasion. Social workers and police officers came in and out. They asked him gentle questions, looking at him with pitying eyes. They offered him juice boxes and sandwiches he didn't want. They asked if he was okay, if he had a place to go. Leo just nodded. He knew how to act. He knew how to make himself look small and invisible. He answered yes and no and never offered any extra information. He was terrified that if he said the wrong thing, his father would somehow find out and punish him, even from inside a jail cell. Leo felt Richard's presence like a ghost haunting the hallways, because there were no other relatives, no grandparents. No aunts or uncles who would step forward. The system was confused about what to do with him. A nice lady named Mrs. Gable from social services sat at the kitchen table with him. She had kind eyes and a soft voice. She told Leo that he might have to stay in a temporary foster home until things got sorted out. The idea of leaving the only house he had ever known, even if it was a house of fear, made Leo panic. He shook his head violently. He told her he could stay alone. He told her he was old enough to take care of himself. Mrs. Gable looked sad and explained that it wasn't allowed, but she promised to do her best to keep him safe. Meanwhile, at the police station and then in the prison visiting room, Richard was busy. He wasn't sitting around feeling sorry for himself. Richard Carter was a fighter, and he was fighting for his life. The evidence against him was strong stacks of paper, digital trails, and witnesses who handled the money. It looked bad. Richard knew that if the case went to trial as it was, he would be locked up for decades. He was too proud to spend his life in a cage. He needed an angle. He needed a way to plant a seed of doubt in the jury's mind. His high-priced lawyers worked around the clock. They were sharp, expensive men in tailored suits who carried briefcases that cost more than most people's cars. They told Richard that the financial evidence was damning. It was hard to explain away millions of missing dollars. So they decided to change the story. They couldn't prove Richard didn't take the money, so they were going to try to prove that he didn't mean to, or that he was under some kind of pressure. They needed to make Richard look like a human being, not a greedy criminal. They needed the court to feel sorry for him, and that is where Leo came in. Richard was allowed one phone call a day. He used these opportunities not to ask Leo if he was eating or sleeping, but to give him orders. It was the same tone he used at home, just quieter. "You listen to me, Leo?" Richard would say, leaning over the metal table in the visiting room, his eyes intense. "The police are trying to twist things. They are trying to make me look like a villain. But you know the truth. You know what kind of father I am?" Leo would sit with his hands in his lap, picking at his cuticles, unable to look his father in the eye. He wanted to scream, "I don't know the truth," but he stayed silent. The plan was simple, but cruel. Richard's legal team decided to subpoena Leo as a character witness. They wanted to put the 12-year-old boy on the stand in front of the judge and the jury. They wanted Leo to tell the court that his father was a good man. They wanted Leo to talk about how Richard raised him alone after his mother died. They wanted stories about homework help and fishing trips and family dinners. If they could show the jury that Richard Carter was a loving, devoted single father, maybe they would believe that he was just confused about the money, or that he was tricked by someone else. They needed to soften Richard's image. The pressure on Leo began to build, invisible and heavy like the humidity before a thunderstorm. Richard's lawyers started visiting the house. They sat in the living room, drinking the coffee that Mrs. Gable made. And they rehearsed with Leo. They didn't ask him what he wanted to say. They told him what to say. Just say this. Leo, the main lawyer, a man with silver hair and a perfect smile, would coach him. When they ask if your father ever lied to you, you say no. When they ask if he is a generous man, you say yes. Just keep it simple. You are the son who loves his father. That is all you have to be. But Leo wasn't just a son. He was a witness to a life of manipulation. He knew that generous meant controlling. He knew that honest meant never getting caught. Every time he practiced the lines the lawyers gave him, he felt a knot tighten in his chest. He felt like he was being asked to lie, but he was so confused. Was it a lie? Richard did provide a house. Richard did buy him food. But the cost of those things was Leo's freedom and his happiness. Days turned into weeks. The trial date was set. The headlines in the newspapers got bigger. The trial of the century, they called it. The whole town was obsessed. Everyone had an opinion. But nobody knew what was happening in Leo's head. He felt like a puppet with too many people pulling the strings. The social workers told him to tell the truth. The lawyers told him to protect his father. His father told him to remember who was in charge. One evening, a few days before the trial was set to begin, Leo sat alone in his room. The house was quiet, but the press was still outside, their cameras like eyes watching the windows. He looked at a photo on his bedside table. It was the only picture he had of his parents together, a small, worn snapshot. In the photo, his mother was laughing. His dad was looking at her with a possessive look that Leo hadn't understood as a baby, but understood now. He realized that his father was going to use him just like he used everyone else as a tool to get what he wanted. Richard truly believed that he could control Leo even from a jail cell. He sent letters to the house, written in neat, perfect handwriting. They weren't love letters. They were instructions. One letter simply said, "Remember, a good son protects his father. Don't let them destroy our family." The message was clear if Leo testified badly. If he told the court about the shouting or the fear or the strange money transactions he had seen, he would be betraying the family. Leo took the letter and hid it under his mattress, right next to the secret spot where he kept his only treasures, a few smooth stones and a toy car. He felt trapped. The trial was looming like a giant mountain he had to climb, and he was terrified of falling off the edge. He knew that in a few days, he would have to walk into that courtroom, sit in the witness chair, raise his right hand, and speak. The question was, would he speak the words his father gave him? Or would he finally find his own voice? The tension in the house was unbearable, a silent scream that no one could hear but him. The morning of the trial arrived with a sky the color of old iron. For most people in Fairview, it was just another Tuesday, but for Leo, it felt like the end of the world. He woke up to the sound of Mrs. Gable moving around in the kitchen, the clinking of cereal bowls sounding unusually loud. Leo lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling fan, his stomach churning with a mix of nerves and dread. Today he had to go to the courthouse. Today he had to see his father. Getting ready was a robotic process. Mrs. Gable had bought him a new outfit for the occasion, a crisp white shirt, dark dress pants, and a tie that felt like a noose around his neck. She fussed with his hair, trying to smooth it down with her hand, her face full of concern. "You look very handsome, Leo," she said gently, trying to give him a smile. "Just remember you tell the truth. That's all that matters." Leo nodded, but he didn't say anything. He knew that the truth meant two different things to the two adults who were controlling his life. To Mrs. Gable and the police, the truth was what actually happened. To his father and his lawyers, the truth was whatever kept Richard out of prison. Leo felt caught in the middle, like a rope in a game of tug-of-war that was slowly tearing apart. The drive to the courthouse was quiet. Mrs. Gable drove carefully, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As they got closer to the center of town, the traffic got heavier. It seemed like half the city was trying to get to the courthouse. When they finally pulled into the parking lot, Leo saw a sea of people. News trucks were everywhere, their satellite dishes pointing up at the gray sky. Reporters were standing on the steps of the grand stone building, speaking into cameras, while people held signs and shouted in the background. It was chaotic. Leo kept his head down, pulling his jacket collar up to hide his face. Mrs. Gable put a protective arm around his shoulders and guided him quickly through the crowd. Flashbulbs went off in his face, blinding him momentarily. He heard voices shouting, "Leo, look over here. Leo, do you think your dad is guilty?" It was overwhelming. He felt like a small animal being hunted by a pack of wolves. He just wanted to disappear. Once they were inside the building, the noise faded away, replaced by the echoing sound of footsteps on marble floors and the hushed whispers of serious people. The courthouse was an intimidating place. It smelled like old wood and floor wax. The ceilings were incredibly high, making Leo feel even smaller than he already was. They walked through metal detectors, which beeped until Leo took off his belt. And then they were directed to courtroom 4. The room itself was large and solemn. The benches were made of dark, polished wood that squeaked when you sat on them. At the front of the room was the judge's bench, raised up high like a throne, looking down over everyone else. On one side was the jury box, empty chairs waiting for the 12 people who would decide his father's fate. On the other side were two tables. The one on the left was for the prosecutors, who looked serious and confident. The one on the right was for the defense. Leo sat in the front row behind the defense table, next to Mrs. Gable. He couldn't bring himself to look at the man sitting at the defense table, but he could feel him there. Richard Carter was wearing a different suit today, a navy blue one that looked expensive and dignified. He sat with his back straight, whispering to his lawyers. He looked calm, almost bored. Seeing him act so normal made Leo's blood run cold. How could he sit there so calmly when he had ruined so many lives? The trial started slowly. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and sharp glasses, came in, and everyone stood up. Then the lawyers began their arguments. The prosecutor stood up and told the jury that Richard Carter was a thief who had stolen money meant to help sick children. He spoke with passion, painting Richard as a greedy liar. Then Richard's lawyer stood up. He told the jury that this was all a big mistake. He said Richard was a good man who had been tricked by someone else and that the numbers were being misunderstood. It was confusing for Leo to hear adults lie so smoothly. Finally, after what felt like forever, it was time for the defense to call their witnesses. They called a few business partners who said Richard was a hard worker. They called a neighbor who said Richard was always polite. And then the lawyer stood up and said the words Leo had been dreading. The defense calls Leo Carter to the stand. Now the room seemed to stop breathing. All eyes turned to the back of the room where Leo was sitting. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard it hurt. Mrs. Gable gave his hand a squeeze and whispered, "You can do this." Leo stood up on shaky legs and walked toward the front of the room. It felt like the longest walk of his life. He passed his father, but he didn't look at him. He climbed up the 3 steps to the witness stand and sat in the big leather chair. The bailiff approached him with a Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the bailiff asked. "I do," Leo whispered. His voice sounded small and pathetic in the big room. Richard's lawyer, the man with the silver hair, stood up in front of him. He didn't look scary. He looked like a nice grandfather. He smiled warmly at Leo.
"Oh, Leo,"
he said softly. "You must be scared. That's okay. We just want to get to know you a little bit. Is your father a good man?" The question hung in the air. Leo looked at the jury. They were looking at him with sympathy. He looked at the judge. He looked at the crowd of people sitting behind him. And then he looked at his father. Richard was staring right at him. His face wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes were narrowed, and he gave the tiniest nod, a signal Leo had seen 1,000 times. It meant say yes. "Yes," Leo said, his voice trembling. "He is. He's a good father." The lawyer nodded happily. "Does he take care of you?" "Yes." "Does he make sure you have food to eat and a warm place to sleep?" "Yes." "Has he ever taught you right from wrong?" Leo thought about all the times his father had taught him how to lie, how to hide money, how to be afraid. But he knew what answer was wanted. "Yes." The lawyer walked Leo through a scripted story. He asked about the tragic death of Leo's mother and how Richard had raised him all alone without any help. Leo felt a lump forming in his throat. He hated talking about his mother. His father had used her death as an excuse for everything for years. Now, the lawyer was using it to make the jury feel sorry for Richard. By the time the lawyer was done asking his questions, half the women in the jury were wiping tears from their eyes. The picture he had painted was perfect: a grieving widower and a devoted son. Torn apart by a misunderstanding, Leo felt sick. He felt like he had betrayed himself, betrayed the truth, and betrayed the people who had actually tried to help him. He had just helped his father weave a net of lies, and he was the bait. "I have no further questions," the lawyer said, sitting down with a satisfied look on his face. The judge looked at the other table. Prosecution. The prosecutor stood up. He was a younger man with messy hair and intense eyes. He buttoned his jacket and walked toward the stand. Leo's stomach dropped. The defense had been easy. They had given him the answers. The prosecutor was a different story. He walked slowly, looking at Leo not with pity, but with focus. "Leo," the prosecutor said, "my colleague asked you if your father is a good man. You said yes? But I want to ask you about what happens inside your house. The defense lawyer jumped up. Objection. Relevance. The boy is a character witness, not a victim. The judge looked over her glasses. I'll allow it. The witness has put the defendant's character in issue. Proceed. The prosecutor stepped closer. Leo, is it true that you are not allowed to have friends over to the house? Leo hesitated. He looked at his father. Richard was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Yes, Leo whispered. Is it true that you have to sit in silence for hours if you make a mistake? I don't know. Do you fear your father, Leo? The room was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. Leo looked at his hands. He wanted to say no, wanted to say what his father wanted. But the adrenaline was pumping through his veins. He felt the walls closing in. He thought about the hidden ledger in his room. He thought about the nights of shouting. He thought about the threats. I just want to go home, Leo said, tears starting to well up in his eyes. That's not an answer, Leo, the prosecutor said gently but firmly. Do you fear him? Leo couldn't speak. He just nodded slightly. The prosecutor paused for effect, letting the silence hang there like a heavy cloud. He had cracked the facade. The perfect picture of the happy family was starting to show its cracks, and everyone in the room could see it. The cross-examination had begun, and it was about to get much, much worse for Richard Carter. The silence that filled the courtroom after Leo's small nod was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. For a moment, nobody moved. The prosecutor stood still, letting the weight of that simple admission sink in. The jury members leaned forward in their seats, their expressions changing from sympathy to confusion and concern. Even the judge stopped writing and looked over her glasses directly at Leo. Richard Carter did not move a muscle. But the change in him was electric. The mask of the calm, loving father had completely vanished. His eyes were locked onto Leo, burning with a cold, terrifying intensity. It was the same look he gave Leo at home when a glass of milk was spilled on the rug, a look that promised consequences. Leo felt that gaze like a physical weight on his shoulders. He was trembling so hard that the wooden armrest of the witness chair was rattling faintly, though in the quiet room. It sounded like a jackhammer to him. The prosecutor let the moment stretch just long enough. Then he took a slow breath and stepped back to his table. He picked up a stack of papers that had been sitting there, ignored until now. No further questions, he said, his voice calm but final. The defense lawyer shot up from his chair. Redirect, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Proceed. The silver-haired lawyer hurried back to the stand, looking a little flustered for the first time. He needed to fix the damage. Leo, he said quickly, trying to regain his friendly grandfather tone. You said you fear your father? But isn't it true that you are just a nervous boy? You've been through a lot. Isn't that fear just the stress of all this attention? Leo looked at the lawyer, then at his father, then at the judge. He felt trapped. He couldn't lie and say it was just stress, but he was too afraid to say more. I don't know, he whispered. You love your father, don't you? The lawyer pressed. Leo's throat felt tight. He did love him in a confusing, painful way. He was his dad. Yes, he whispered again. Thank you. No more questions. The judge looked at the clock on the wall. We will take a short recess before closing arguments. Bailiff, please escort the witness. Leo stood up, his legs feeling like jelly. He couldn't look at anyone as he walked down the steps of the stand. As he passed the defense table, his father leaned in close. Leo thought he was going to say something, but Richard just whispered, not a word. It was a threat so quiet only Leo could hear. But it hit him like a punch. Leo followed the bailiff out of the courtroom, away from the staring eyes. He didn't go back to the hallway where Mrs. Gable was waiting. Instead, the bailiff took him to a small, windowless room nearby. It was a quiet room meant for witnesses to wait. Leo sat in a hard plastic chair, burying his face in his hands. He had messed up. He had shown fear. His father was going to be so angry. He felt sick. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, the trial resumed. The lawyers gave their closing arguments. The prosecutor spoke about the facts, the millions of dollars, the fake accounts, the stolen charity money. He said Richard was a master manipulator who had tricked everyone. The defense lawyer argued that Richard was a good man who had made accounting errors, a devoted father who was being punished for a mistake he didn't understand. Then, the judge gave the jury their instructions. She told them to look at the facts, but she also said they could consider the character of the defendant. She reminded them that Richard had raised his son alone under difficult circumstances. It seemed like a small detail, but it was the hook Richard was hanging his hope on. If the jury liked him, maybe they wouldn't send him away for life. The jury left the room to deliberate. The wait began. It lasted for hours. The sun went down, and the streetlights outside the courthouse flickered on. The reporters packed up their cameras, and the crowd thinned out. But the tension inside the courtroom remained thick. Finally, after 6 long hours, the bailiff announced, "The jury has reached a verdict." Everyone scrambled back to their seats. Richard stood up, straightening his jacket. Mrs. Gable found Leo in the quiet room and brought him back inside. He was pale and exhausted. The jury filed in. They looked serious, tired, and unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. The judge spoke. "Will the defendant please rise?" Richard stood, holding his head high. "On the count of fraud in the first degree, how do you find?" "We find the defendant." The foreman began. The air in the room felt sucked out. Leo held his breath. "Guilty." The word echoed. Richard's face didn't change, but his hands gripped the table edge until his knuckles turned white. "On the count of embezzlement?" "Guilty, guilty, guilty, guilty. On all counts." The room erupted in a murmur of shocked whispers. The gavel banged loudly. "Order! Order in the court." It was over. Richard Carter was going to prison. The relief washed over Leo, cool and sweet. He sagged against Mrs. Gable, tears finally coming to his eyes. He had done it. He had survived. His father was going away. The nightmare was ending, but the judge wasn't finished. She looked over her glasses at Richard. "Mr. Carter, the evidence presented was overwhelming. You stole from the most vulnerable members of our community. However, this court also recognizes that you are the sole guardian of a minor child. Sending a single father to prison for a long term has serious consequences for the child." Richard's lawyer perked up. Here was the chance for leniency. "I am prepared to sentence you," the judge continued, "to the minimum allowed by law, taking into consideration your son's situation. But before I finalize this sentencing, there is one matter that was brought to my attention by the prosecution regarding the evidence seized from your home." She picked up a piece of paper. "During the search of your residence, police found a locked safe hidden in the floor of your son's bedroom. This was not entered into evidence during the trial because it was found after the initial search. But it has been verified by the police department. The contents of this safe were not financial records. They were personal items belonging to your son." Leo froze. He had forgotten about the safe. It was the one thing he had managed to keep hidden, the one thing his father didn't know he had taken. But the police had found it. "Leo," the judge said, looking at the boy, "is there anything you wish to say regarding this matter, or regarding your relationship with your father, before I pass this sentence?" The room went silent. Richard turned slowly to look at his son. The look in his eyes was no longer just anger. It was pure panic. The prosecution hadn't used the safe in the trial because it was questionable evidence. But the judge was giving Leo a chance now. Leo stood up. His legs were shaking, but he felt a sudden rush of adrenaline. He looked at the judge, then at the jury, and finally at his father. He thought about the years of silence, the fear and the control. He thought about the ledger, the threats, and the lies. He realized that if his father got a light sentence because the judge felt sorry for a devoted dad, Leo would never truly be free. His father would come back one day, or he would control him from prison. Leo took a deep breath. He realized he held the key to his own freedom. It wasn't in the safe. It was in his voice. "Yes, Your Honor," Leo said, his voice clear and steady for the first time in his life. "There is something I need to show you." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. Every single person was focused on the small boy standing in the witness box. Leo looked different now. His shoulders weren't hunched forward anymore. He looked at his father, not with the fear of a victim, but with the steady gaze of someone who had finally found his courage. Richard Carter looked like a statue that was cracking. The color was draining from his face, and his mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. He knew. He knew that the control he had held over Leo for years was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The judge leaned forward, her expression serious but kind. "What is it you wish to show us, Leo?" Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old and crinkled, as if it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. His hands were shaking a little, but his grip was tight. "Before the police took me away," Leo said, his voice echoing slightly in the large room, "I hid something. My dad. He always told me that if I was good, if I did exactly what he said, I would stay safe. He told me that the world was a dangerous place, and that he was the only one who could protect me. He said that if I ever told anyone our secrets, something bad would happen to me." Leo paused and looked directly at Richard. "But sitting in my room, waiting for this day, I realized something. The danger wasn't out there. It was sitting at my dinner table. It was the man telling me what to do." A low murmur went through the crowd, but the judge tapped her gavel once, silencing them instantly. Leo unfolded the paper. "This is a ledger," he explained, holding it up so the jury could see it. "For the last 3 years, my father made me keep a record of his transactions. He said he was too busy, that I needed to learn how to be a man. He made me write down every time he moved money. He made me write down the fake names he used for the bank accounts. He made me sign my name to the bottom of the pages." The prosecutor stood up immediately. "Your Honor, may we approach? This is new evidence." Richard's lawyer was on his feet in a second, shouting, "Objection. This is highly irregular. The trial is essentially over. We have a verdict." The boy is confused. "This is just a child's diary." The judge looked over her glasses at the defense lawyer. "Sit down," she said firmly. "The jury has reached a verdict, yes, but sentencing has not yet occurred. If this material is relevant to the character and actions of the defendant, I will hear it." She looked at Leo. "Bring the ledger to the bench, Leo." Leo walked down the steps of the stand. As he passed Richard, his father tried to grab his arm. "Don't you do it," Richard hissed, his eyes wild. "I am your father." Leo pulled his arm away quickly. "No," Leo said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're just a thief." He walked up to the judge's bench and handed her the paper. The judge took it and began to read. Her eyes moved back and forth across the page. As she read, her eyebrows went up. She turned the page and then the next. The room was dead silent. It took her 3 minutes to read the entire thing. When she was done, she looked down at Richard. The disappointment on her face was heavy. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, her voice cold, "this ledger, it details complex money laundering. It dates back years. And there are notes in the margins." She looked down at the paper again and read aloud. "Make Leo sign the check so the bank thinks it's him. Tell the auditors Leo made a mistake if they ask. Leo is the perfect cover because no one suspects a kid." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. The jurors looked at each other in shock. The nice story about the confused widower who made accounting errors was dead. This was proof of a calculated plan to use his own son as a tool to commit crimes. Richard's face fell. He looked old suddenly. The charm was gone, leaving only a selfish, angry man. The judge looked at the prosecutor. "This changes the context of the crimes entirely. This shows premeditation and the corruption of a minor." The judge slammed her gavel down. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I am setting aside the jury's verdict on the lesser counts. Based on this new evidence and the testimony of this witness, I am entering a finding of guilty on all counts, including aggravated fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Furthermore, I am remanding Mr. Carter into custody immediately to await a new sentencing hearing for these enhanced charges." 2 police officers walked over to Richard. He didn't fight them this time. He let them handcuff him. As they turned him to lead him away, he looked back at Leo one last time. There was no love in that look. Only pure hatred. You'll regret this, Richard spat. Leo didn't flinch. He watched them drag his father toward the side door. I already did, Leo whispered back. As the door closed behind Richard, the tension in the room broke. People started talking excitedly. Mrs. Gable ran up to the stand and hugged Leo tight. He buried his face in her shoulder and finally let himself cry. These weren't tears of sadness, though. They were tears of relief. He realized he wasn't just safe from going to a foster home. He was safe from his father, but there was one more secret Leo had to share. He hadn't told the police about it because he was too scared, but he knew he couldn't keep it anymore. The judge was still organizing her papers when Leo pulled away from Mrs. Gable. Your Honor? Leo said quietly. The judge looked up. Yes, Leo. My mom, he started, his voice trembling again. My dad always told me she died in a car accident. He told me she was gone because she was careless. He said, if I wasn't perfect, I'd end up like her, dead and forgotten. The courtroom went still again. Go on, the judge encouraged. She's not dead, Leo said, the truth rushing out of him like water from a broken dam. I found letters in the attic. He hid them. She left him. She ran away because he was hurting her too. She wrote to me, but he never let me see them. He made me think she abandoned me. Leo reached into his other pocket and pulled out a stack of envelopes that were yellowed with age. Her address is on the last one. She's in a small town in Oregon. She wrote that she tried to take me with her, but he threatened to kill her if she did. The judge took the letters gently. She looked at the postmarks. They were from years ago, but the most recent one was only a month old. She looked at Richard's empty seat, then back at Leo. Thank you, Leo, she said softly. We will make sure the authorities in Oregon are contacted. You have been very brave today. Walking out of the courthouse that night was different from walking in. The flashbulbs from the cameras were still going off. But the reporters weren't shouting questions about the trial anymore. They were cheering. They were clapping. They saw a hero instead of a victim. Leo held his head up high. The heavy weight he had carried on his shoulders for so long was gone. The legal system worked. But it wasn't the lawyers or the judge who saved him in the end. It was Leo. He saved himself. He realized that his voice was the most powerful weapon he had. He had spent years being afraid of the truth, but he learned that the truth is actually what sets you free. Weeks later, the town of Fairview went back to normal. The big house was sold, and the money Richard stole was returned to the charity. Richard Carter was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with no chance of parole for a long time. And Leo? He sat on a front porch of a small blue house in Oregon. The sun was shining, and the air smelled like pine trees. A woman with kind eyes and hair the same color as Leo's sat next to him, brushing his hair off his forehead. She didn't tell him to sit up straight. She didn't tell him to be quiet. She just held his hand. I'm glad you found me, his mom said softly. Leo looked at her and smiled a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Me too, he said. He wasn't the boy in the shadows anymore. He was Leo. A kid who liked soccer and comic books. A kid with a future. He had looked into the darkness and refused to let it win, and that made all the difference.